to the latest in the Next Generation Science Standards webinar series in Earth and Space Science. This series is sponsored by the National Association of Geoscience Teachers and by the American Geosciences Institute. I'm Susan Sullivan, and I am at University of Colorado Boulder, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. I'd also like to thank Aida Awad and Ed Robeck for helping to organize this, and as always, John McDarris for his help with getting us all organized and providing us with this technology. So today, we have several presenters who are talking about developing curriculum for Next Generation Science Standards for a statewide project in Michigan. Our presenters are Jackie Huntoon and Doug Oppliger. And Jackie is Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at Michigan Tech University. Doug is the coordinator for education, coordinator for curriculum development and implementation for the MyStar project. We're also joined by Ed Robeck and Matt Hoover with the American Geosciences Institute. Ed, in addition to being one of the organizers of this NGSS effort, is also Director of Education and Outreach at the American Geosciences Institute. Before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to make you aware of other webinars that are coming up in the series. On the 9th, we will have a presentation from Achieve, which is the organization which got NGSS organized and launched for the community. We'll have that webinar on March 9th at this time on the second Thursday. On April 13th, we'll be looking at climate education in NGSS with the CLEAN Collection, which is a peer-reviewed collection of energy and climate learning resources. And on May 11th, we'll be looking at NGSS resources across the sciences and how those connect to geosciences with the AAAS, the American Chemical Society, and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. If you would like to be notified when this webinar is archived and available to share with others or to look at again, you can sign up for that notification on this link. And that is also a link that will give you announcements of future events and future webinars. If you're joining us for the first time, if you're not on that email list, we very much encourage you to sign up for that and stay part of the conversation. So with that, I would like to just point out a couple of the faces that go with the names here, and maybe that can help you recognize people at meetings or whatnot. But with that, I'll turn it over to the presenters and listen to more of lessons from MyStar.
Hey, this is Ed Robeck, and thank you very much, Susan, for the introduction. We have, let's see, we have the slides as well, so when you look at the archive, you can see the names and positions of the people. But I'm going to jump in here to this slide where this is just an outline of how we're going to approach the webinar. This series of webinars actually was initiated as an outgrowth of a summit meeting in 2015. I'm going to mention a couple things about that. And then you'll get an overview of the MyStar project from Jackie Huntoon. And then we're going to talk about some of the challenges that we've faced working to develop a project of this magnitude and the lessons that we've learned as we've gone through that. And Jackie, Matt, and I, and Doug will each share a bit about that. We'll summarize briefly, and then there'll be time for some announcements at the end. And in between these, we've left time for questions as well. So regarding the summit meeting, some of you may know that in 2015, late April, about 50 people from a number of organizations, about as many organizations, came together in Washington, D.C. It was hosted by NOAA, funded by AGI and NSF, to discuss the needs of the community in terms of implementing the NGSS in the Earth and Space Sciences. And all I'm going to say about that is that before that meeting, we did a pre-summit needs assessment that was both qualitative and quantitative in nature. And so we had a number of themes that emerged in that needs assessment, which meant that as we went into the MyStar development, we did have some idea of some of the challenges that we would come up against as we worked with the NGSS-aligned curriculum development. And that was really helpful to us as we were thinking about what we needed to pay attention to and how we needed to organize the effort. These were the 6 areas that that needs assessment came up with. Right now, what we're going to do is move into an overview of MyStar that Jackie Huntoon, who's the PI on the grant, is going to outline.
Thanks, Ed. So to just tell you a little bit about MyStar, that stands for the Michigan Science Teaching and Assessment Reform Project. And basically what we're trying to do with this project is to develop an entire middle school curriculum that is NGSS-aligned and integrates the various science disciplines as well as engineering to look at real-world phenomena or problems. And then coupled with that, coupled with the curriculum development, is teacher professional development and preparation, because we know that the curriculum helps people move towards NGSS-aligned instruction, but without proper preparation, the teachers are probably not going to be able to enact all the reform that's been envisioned. So this project was supported by the Herbert H. and Grace A. Dow Foundation, and we feel very fortunate to have that funding. And it builds on a previous project called MyTEP, which was an NSF Math Science Partnership project. And I see one of our collaborators on the attendee list here, Steve Maddox from Michigan, who was involved with MyTEP and continues to be involved in MyStar. So the NSF Math Science Partnership grants were characterized by several factors, and 2 of them are listed here, which have been really important for MyStar. First of all, they're partnership-driven, which means that it's not about the higher education faculty and researchers going in to fix the schools and teachers, but rather the idea was that the higher education people would learn from the K-12 teachers and vice versa. And I think through our MyTEP project, we developed a pretty strong network throughout the state of Michigan, and we've been able to build on that with MyStar. And then in addition, the MSPs were research-based, meaning that they were supposed to build on the results of research and conduct research to inform continual improvement. So when we started MyStar, we had a few school districts involved with us, our MyTEP schools. That's now grown to 11 and growing. It grew to 11 this week and may grow to 12 next week, so there's interest. And we also have staff members who are paid off of the project that include scientists and engineers, K-12 teachers, and then education experts. And AGI has been involved. Ed and Matt Hoover, who are both involved in this presentation, have helped us to make sure that we're doing good educational practice. And also the project's really been enabled by support from a lot of friends, including people within the Michigan Department of Education, the Michigan Math Science Centers, which is a statewide network of professional development providers, and an external advisory board. So, one of the features about the curriculum from the start was that we really wanted to focus on real-world challenges and phenomena and use science and engineering practices to address those problems and phenomena. So we've really taken an application-oriented approach. And in developing the curriculum, we've designed something we call unit challenges, which really give the context and provide the opportunity for students to develop skills and understanding and then refine their skills and understanding over an extended period of time. So the teacher professional development and education components, we started out having the teachers help us with curriculum development, and through that process, we've been able to develop a cadre of teacher leaders who are now leading professional learning communities in their schools and across different schools. And we found that because of the geographical challenges that Michigan faces, we're a very large state and much of the state is very rural, that we needed to make use of online tools to do professional development because it simply is not possible to do face-to-face in all cases. We've also built on other initiatives within the state and outside so that we can make use of skills teachers already have. So we're just starting the third year of our project, and we are in the pilot testing phase, about to start some field testing of a few units. And I think our greatest strength is there's a lot of enthusiasm for people who've worked with us, and you can see Steve there being enthusiastic at the very outset. So we have 240 teachers working with us to date, and we've pilot tested with 2,287 students. And I guess the most encouraging thing for us is that the teachers who've worked with us are saying, we're going to wait for the MyStar curriculum. This is the curriculum we want to use. However, that's also really frightening to us because that means we have to really work hard to make this happen for everyone. So in the next couple slides, I just wanted to look at some of the successes we've had through the curriculum development process. And first of all, if you were at the summit, I showed a preliminary version of this chart there, and it's been refined since then. So what this chart shows is a series of rows, and this is the 6th grade, the 7th grade, the 8th grade, and then the number of units per grade ranges from 7 to 8. And if we take a closer look at all of these, I can unpack this a little bit. So for this unit here circled, for the 6th grade unit, the cross-cutting concepts that are addressed in that unit are shown as at the top. The number of the unit, meaning it's 6th grade, 6 units. The performance expectation package, these are the NGSS performance expectations that are incorporated into the unit. And finally, something called the MyStar theme. The E got, at least on my screen, the E is down here, but that's okay. So every MyStar unit has a theme, and in the chart on the preceding page, the color codes of the different boxes indicate which theme that particular unit is aligned with. For the cross-cutting concepts in each of the units, we found that the best approach, after we played with this for quite a while, was to address 2 different cross-cutting concepts throughout an entire semester rather than changing them unit by unit. And I think in the next slide, Matt's going to talk a little bit about the overall unit structure and then the structure of the lessons.
Hi, my name is Matt Hoover. I'm an education specialist at the American Geosciences Institute and a contributor to the development of lessons and units on MyStar. Just to give you all a general sense of kind of how units are structured, there's this slide here shows kind of basic features of each of the units. First of all, there is a unit challenge. Each unit has a unit challenge. This is a performance task in which students demonstrate their understanding of concepts and skills that they learn throughout the unit. The unit challenge is a culminating assessment and kind of serves as a destination point that drives the unit. And so within lessons, students build understanding necessary for them to be able to complete the unit challenge. And in this way, the unit challenge provides, it serves as a motivator for students and gives them a purpose for their learning and a context. The second feature of each unit is the unit question. Unit questions, they focus units and they frame the units. Unit questions they're open-ended, they're thought-provoking, engaging. They generally call for higher order thinking, such as analysis and evaluation and prediction. And a unit question does not have a simple answer. So students are presented the unit question early in the unit, and they revisit the unit questions throughout the unit as they progress through the various lessons. And as students develop knowledge throughout the unit, they apply that knowledge to the answering of the unit question. And in this way, the unit question stimulates student thinking and, again, motivates them to learn. Each unit contains approximately 7 to 10 lessons, and each lesson contains a lesson question. The lesson questions, each lesson may have between 1 and 3 lesson questions. The lesson questions are a finer-grained examination of the unit question. So the unit question is very broad in scope and overarching. The lesson questions are more focused on specific topics and skills. And the lesson questions, they guide students towards the unit question. Within each MyStar unit, the 7 to 10 lessons that are there can be kind of categorized into 4 different types of lessons. The first type of lesson is the unit opener lesson. This is lesson 1, and the first lesson sets the stage for the unit and focuses students their attention on the unit topic as well as the unit question. It is in this lesson that students, their prior knowledge and experience of the unit topic is elicited as well. The second lesson is the intro to the challenge lesson, and this is where students examine aspects of the unit challenge, and they also generate a plan for addressing the unit challenge. After this come the middle lessons. The middle lessons, there might be some number of middle lessons, maybe 5 to 7 middle lessons, and these form the body of the unit. And the middle lessons are where the various content of the unit is developed through three-dimensional approach to instruction. So students apply the 3 dimensions of the next generation standards and the performance expectations. And finally, the last lesson of each unit is the unit closer lesson. And this is where students formalize their understanding of the unit question, and they also complete their response to the unit challenge. Now, each lesson is designed following the MyStar instructional model. The MyStar instructional model is a sequencing of phases. There are 5 instructional phases within the model, and learning proceeds from one phase to another during the implementation of a lesson. So the phases are sequenced to support the development of student learning over time. Students within each phase, they will engage in multiple science and engineering practices, and the basic underlying theory for this model is that students should discuss and test and develop their ideas before concepts are formally introduced. So students progress through each of these phases within each of the lessons within each unit. I will now pass on to Ed Robeck to talk about some of the challenges and lessons learned from MyStar.
So as you can get by now, to develop a curriculum of this complexity, to say that that's complex is an understatement. There are a number of challenges that we've experienced, and we wanted to share some of those today in a number of areas, as I said, curriculum design, political considerations, and management. And I'm just going to share talk about 4 areas in curriculum design now, and some of the lessons that we learned as we have been doing this work. The first challenge comes about because of the 3-dimensional design of the NGSS, which many of you probably know includes DCIs, or disciplinary core ideas, science and engineering practices, SEPs, and cross-cutting concepts. This was a new approach to science education when the framework and standards came out. The framework for K-12 science education preceded the next generation science standards, which meant that none of us really had specific and direct experience with this kind of a model, and there were no materials that were developed either that could give us a go-by. At best, the current materials, even the best ones, were kind of approximations of the intent of the NGSS. as well, because we brought together so many different people, we had limited shared experience as a group as well. And that was especially true with respect to engineering education. Many of us were science educators, but had not had that much experience with the elements of engineering that were built into the NGSS. And as many of us know, too, there's very limited guidance initially as we started this project on what assessment would look like. So as we started thinking about, working with the end in mind, there really wasn't clear guidance about what that end would look like. So we did look at what other organizations, NSTA and chief among them, had to offer. We reviewed those. We took lessons from those. And one of the things that, a lesson too, that we really felt has become important is just this openness to learning and experimenting, revising, collaborating with others. Jackie talked about all the different partnerships and the networks that have been developed around this, and taking as much direction as we can from those. But that in-house professional development that Jackie mentioned has become very, very important as well, because so many of of us didn't have that shared experience, and that professional development that we've all been through provided that, so we at least speak a common language. As well, involving the network of teachers that Jackie mentioned has been very important, because they give us a reality check as we go forward, and they also contribute quite a lot of expertise in terms of what works in classrooms and lesson ideas and such. Something that you can see throughout the MyStar material, and Jackie and Matt gave you some indication of that, those graphics that they showed are documentations of a lot of our thinking. Especially the Michigan Tech folks have been very, very good about maintaining records of decisions that have been made and tools so that the learning could be captured and we didn't have to relearn or renegotiate a lot of things as we went forward. And just as much as not having certain kinds of experience wasn't a challenge, some of the experience that we did bring to it created some interesting challenges. I'll refer to this as negative transfer, in that some of the past experience could actually mislead us. So, for example, when we look at the science and engineering practices, we think about those as akin to what some of us learned as science skills or science process skills. And while there is a relationship there, they're really handled very differently in the next generation science standards. So bringing that experience that we had into this development could actually mislead us in some ways, and we had to be very careful about that. The other thing that a lot of us had done, being science educators at various levels, was we had planned lessons for our own students. And while that contributes to curriculum design, designing curriculum for somebody else's classroom, a different context than your own, a different set of students, a more general setting, is a different set of skills than lesson planning. They're related, but they are different, and we had to really grapple with that as well throughout this process. So some of the things that we did was to remind ourselves of some of the fundamentals of science education, for example, conceptual change literature, referring back repeatedly to the framework, which was the base for NGSS, and the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine publications, such as Taking Science to School, many of which are referenced in the framework, but they give us some really fundamental information to keep in mind as we went forward, so that we weren't just making assumptions about how things were intended. And then one of the things that we did, too, in MyStar and have done is avoiding things that are too familiar. So the National Academies has already spoken about the cautions about the term inquiry, where it means so many different things to so many different people that it loses some of its potency when it's communicating ideas. Same was true for us with the 5E model. We started using the 5E model, the 5E learning cycle, but really felt like it was causing people to resonate with things that preceded NGSS in terms of approaches. So we took some inspiration there. We went back to some fundamental literature about learning, and we developed a different learning structure, different lesson structure. And then just continually shaping and reshaping elements so that we could communicate effectively about them and address problems as we went on was also very important to us. And anybody who's developed curriculum materials or other projects, you run into this idea of wanting things to be perfect, and that was certainly the case for us as well. We're all professionals. We all really wanted to do a good job for our colleagues and our friends in the field. But you may have heard the saying that the perfect can be the enemy of the very good. So we really had to think about how much was enough, how much comprehensive do the materials need to be, how much detail do we need, and how much direction do the teachers really need in order to do these lessons well. So we've been working very hard to define what is necessary, sufficient, and presentable, and document that and think about the principles that can apply to in those ways. Making use a lot of the time of teacher input, getting them to tell us what do students know, what can students do, what do teachers need, and that's been very, very helpful in terms of staying grounded in the realities of classroom. And communicating clear beginning and ending points to the developers. Though that very colorful graphic that Jackie showed you that had the matrix of the grade 6, 7, and 8 units allowed us to see how the students would develop their knowledge base and skill set through the different units, and that gave the unit developers clear ideas about where they needed to start and where they could end and where the students would pick up going on from there. And this is the approach that we took and really stayed with those unit designs. Something that we also had to do was to assume a certain level of skill in terms of the teacher practice. We couldn't develop for every novice teacher that was out there, so how do we deal with this? Well, one of the things was that professional development program that Jackie mentioned that was an online professional development program that teachers go through as they start to work with MyStar, and that gives us a base expectation about what the teachers know and are able to do as they start to implement MyStar units. And that allowed us to avoid building professional development into the units themselves. We found ourselves starting to write in instructions about some very basic practices and instruction, and that allowed us to avoid doing that, which made some of the units more cumbersome, and we were able to make them more lean by reducing that. And then recognizing that there are multiple entry points for how curriculum design can take place. One of the things that has been done very typically is, in the past, is you started with what are essentially the DCIs, or the disciplinary core ideas, the content, and then layer on skills and layer on themes or other things. That's the past experience, and that also could mislead us, because that's really not the intent of the next generation science standards. The intent is to maintain that integrated three-dimensional approach throughout, and that was what those packets and real close attention to the PEs allowed us to do. And again, the question of what does assessment look like was a struggle for us, because since there was no three-dimensional assessment and still is, that's just emerging, understanding what units had to prepare students to be able to know and do remains a challenge in this design. One of the things that we did to address this was create what we call a staged and iterative process, which is kind of like if you've ever seen those diagrams of dance steps. It's kind of like that. We have 4 stages. One is shown here in the diagram, and we go back and forth between the stages, reviewing the units across those stages and across the elements within the stages. There are 5 elements lists shown there. The ones in blue are the more formal elements of the standards. The purple are more abstract, broader level sort of guidance, and the pink is the experiential relevance elements, and those are present in all 4 of the levels. So maintaining that process through iterating through this process and keeping that integration, the focus throughout, and keeping the PEs, keeping ourselves aligned with the performance expectations has been maintained through that kind of a process. The other thing that we did was to focus primarily on guidance and tools for the teacher. A lot of past curriculum projects start with developing student materials and then build teacher materials out to address those and to support those. We chose to go the other way, that is to develop guidance for the teacher, the teaching materials first, still providing some of the student materials, some of the resources that teachers would need, but also allowing them the flexibility to implement the guidance as they saw fit using materials that they had available to themselves. So that's a pretty quick run-through of some of the challenges and some of the ways that we address the challenges in curriculum design. We do have time for a couple of questions now. I don't know, I haven't been watching the chat box, so I don't know if anything's come up. Is there anything in particular that anybody would like to ask at this point?
See, some people are typing in. One thing could you talk through one of the units, for example, in terms of what is the unit challenge and what are some of the lessons that go underneath it? Just to put some more specificity on the model.
Hang on a second. I'm going to put Matt on the phone, and you're going to have to ask the question again, Susan, because Matt, I'm using a telephone and Matt didn't hear the question.
Yes.
And I think my question is essentially the same as Lori's, which is, could you talk specifically about one of the units that's in process in terms of how the challenge and the lessons build on each other specifically?
Sure. You mean in terms of the content of a lesson and maybe what a lesson looks, content of a unit and what that unit looks like in terms of the individual lessons? Is that what you're thinking?
Yes.
Yeah, briefly. A unit that I was working on closely was one that was it was an ecology unit for sixth graders, and the students would look at various ecology principles related to species interaction. So, looking at predator-prey relationships, looking at how species interact, and looking at invasive species and how that can impact species interaction within an ecosystem. So that was kind of the concepts that students were looking at in the unit, and the unit topic was species interactions in ecosystems. Again, this is at a sixth grade level, so the conceptually it's pretty basic, but the unit challenge was for students to look at Michigan ecosystems. So this is part of the MyStar approach, is to make is for units to have a local focus, so that students have a local perspective and context for what they're learning. So students looked at Michigan ecosystems and the impact of invasive species on Michigan ecosystems, and their challenge was to identify one ecosystem of the many ecosystems that are in Michigan, identify one ecosystem and develop a management plan for an invasive species in that ecosystem. So that was the unit challenge. So that's kind of was the end point, was what they were working towards. So the lessons then progressed from students initially learning, what is an ecosystem, what are the components of an ecosystem, the abiotic and biotic components of an ecosystem, how species interact with each other as well as with the abiotic components of an ecosystem, and how those species interactions affect populations, and then ultimately, what is the impact of an invasive species, and how, and all the while, as they're doing each of the, going through the unit and looking at these different sub-concepts, they were looking at Michigan-specific ecosystems and species. So, so that's generally what one unit looks like. Again, that one being a very much an ecology and life science focused unit. Some of the other units are they're more integrated. Some are more integrated than others, I should say, where they're integrating physical science, earth science, and life science concepts. Some are a little bit more focused on one of those disciplines more so than others. Is that answering your questions? Does that give you a sense of kind of what?
That helps a lot. And
yeah.
And to get to the rest of Lori's question, could you say specific? So for the example you gave, which were the cross-cutting concepts that were highlighted there, and what would you say about the main skills that scientific practices that
students were employing during that ecosystems unit.
Sure. So, you know, it's difficult for students to go out and go into an ecosystem and actually do their own investigations and collect their own data. That's hard, right? Because they're not able to do that. For a teacher to take a group of students out and count certain organisms that are within an ecosystem, they just don't have the time or capability to do that. So this particular unit was very much data driven. So the students are being given data that's being collected by scientists, and the curriculum developers of this unit, they had to go find that data and then assemble it and make it and put it into a form that was accessible to students. So students were given quite a bit of data, are given quite a bit of data in this unit, and the science and engineering practice that they apply probably the most is analyzing and interpreting data. There's also quite a bit of modeling, so they would take some of that data and then they would create models based on that data. And the cross-cutting concept that kind of, and this is very much related to analyzing and interpreting data, the cross-cutting concept that fit well within this unit was patterns, and students looking for patterns, and mainly they're looking for patterns in data, and looking at patterns in relationships between species. Based on the data that they're given. So the kind of beyond the data, some of the observations that they were able to make and kind of was through the use of video, which I think was kind of an innovative part of this particular unit. So students were maybe looked at predator-prey relationships that the developers found videos that were available online, and students could look at, for example, a predator-prey relationship through a video, and make some observations, and then kind of collect some basic data from that they would then examine to various degrees through a lesson or throughout the unit. So is that?
I think that helps. I think that helps a lot to understand this specifics, and I'm really looking forward to seeing, the rest of my STAR curriculum when you're ready to release that. And so, Lori, if I can see that you're typing. If you have a follow-on question to that, then we'll look to that. Oh, good. It looks like that helps. So
okay.
Nicole has a question. Can you say more about how the 5Es might align? It sounds like you're using essentially a 5E approach, but not necessarily calling it 5E. So can you say some more about the alignment there with your process?
Sure. It really was strategic. There's really no inherent mismatch between the 5E learning cycle that BSCS developed and the NGSS. But some teachers who have been using the 5E learning cycle for a long time and know that language and know that structure, when they saw lessons that were built in the 5E structure, felt an echo of past teaching styles and past teaching approaches that were not NGSS-aligned. And so to avoid that problem of them seeing, oh, this is just like the old stuff, we felt we needed to move away from that particular set of terms and concepts, at least in terms of language.
But you do find that in terms of philosophy, it's well aligned with what you're doing.
Sure, it's a tool. I personally find a lot of potential in the 5E learning cycle for NGSS implementation. There's no, like I said, there's no inherent mismatch, but it's all in how it's used. And there are lessons that can follow a 5E structure that are not necessarily aligned with NGSS, but it certainly can be as well.
But hey, this is Doug Oppliger. Can I just jump in here real quick?
Sure.
I just wanted to point out, like, one place where that was a little problematic with 5Es was the fact that we are always tying back to the unit challenge, which we could using 5Es, we could put that in the elaborate E, but we were told by some experts that it really was different, the fact that we had this unit challenge that ran through the whole unit and we were always connecting back to that same challenge. So that was like one example where there's a little bit of a variance.
So you're looking at it really at a larger level. It's not like all the learning happens in one lesson. It has to build. Even though you've got a structure within one lesson, it builds over the course of the unit.
Exactly.
Okay, great. I see a question asking you to describe more about a unit where the engineering practices are highlighted.
Maybe, Susan, I'm going to suggest that we move on to another section of the webinar and come back to these, just because we've got the other two sections on management and politics.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, sounds fine to me. It's your webinar.
Yeah, and whoever asked about the engineering practices, that's something that we just had a paper published that talked about that a little bit, so we might be able to send you a reprint of it and you could see that, for example. So moving on to another challenge and lessons learned area, the political frame. So anything to do with education is almost by definition highly political. And when we started MyStar, the state had not even adopted yet the new Michigan science standards, which were NGSS-aligned. So there was a lot of work behind the scenes in the state to make sure that our state adopted the new standards. And, it took a while, but eventually they were adopted. And then the next question was, would the legislature actually provide funding to provide professional development to teachers and provide the high-stakes tests that would test in this new way? And so far the answer is yes, but the mechanisms for state funding for teacher PD have changed every single year. So one of our challenges has been every single year we have to submit an entirely new form of application so that teachers can use us as a PD provider. And this just takes a lot of work to keep writing your proposal in different formats every year, but that's okay. Also, thinking about the expectations of our partners. So, teachers and schools would like to have an entire curriculum delivered to them immediately at zero cost with any materials necessary provided and the PD there face-to-face when they need it. And obviously, that's impossible, so trying to come up with solutions that work for the schools and districts as well as for us is something that we think a lot about. And, for example, the online PD was one of our ways to address this need. We also try to really support the school districts and our teachers, and they try to support us because we all feel like we're in this together, and we either win and are successful together, or we will have many more challenges in the future. And we found that by putting different people in front of different groups to deliver the MyStar message, we can be more impactful. So teachers are believed by fellow teachers. School district administrators like to talk to people at the Department of Education or higher ed people or other administrators, et cetera, et cetera. So trying to get the message out there, delivered by the right person, and then when we have a lot of people talking about messages, trying to make sure that we're all delivering the same message. So there are certain things that, for example, I'm not allowed to talk about anymore because I'm just not as much in the know as other people. And that's the end of this section, so we can go back a little to questions if we want about politics or just move on. I kind of think, Susan, if it's okay, I would say we should just move on.
I agree.
Okay. So the management of a project and team such as this has been challenging, and so I'm the principal investigator, so at that level, what my role mainly has been is to provide the overall vision for the project and the strategy for moving forward, try to make sure the resources are available, set reasonable expectations among our team and all the external stakeholders, and keep our morale high. So the people who are working on this project work incredibly hard, and they're extremely dedicated, and they're very passionate. And the reason they feel that way is because we have the opportunity here to make a difference in children's lives throughout our state, And as a result of the pilot testing, we're starting to see that happen. And it's very exciting, but part of my job is to make sure that cheerleading keeps going back to the people who are working really long hours and trying to make this all happen. We've experimented through the project with a whole bunch of different governance models, so more top-down, nice org charts, completely shared governance so that we all had to come to agreement as a group. And there are pros and cons to each of those, and I think now we have a pretty good structure going where we do have a lot of small teams working together, but then reporting up through a hierarchy, so we don't have to have quite as many large group discussions as we did at the start, although those were probably needed to get us going so that we were all on the same page about where we were heading out to. And finally, you know, a big part of my role now is strategic decision making. So every week or so, someone will come to someone in our group and say, hey, would you like to partner on this proposal, or, you know, could we do this together? And in some cases it makes sense for us, and in other cases it doesn't, because it pulls people away from the tasks we're trying to get accomplished before the end of our funding period. So I think Doug's going to talk a little bit more about day-to-day management challenges that he deals with.
So, thanks, Jackie. I'm going to just build on what everybody else has presented and focus on, you know, how we assemble and then get our team to do this. How do we build the lesson plans and the units, the tools for the teachers that they're going to use in the classrooms, as well as the thinking about the assessment, the professional development, and the research that goes along with this. As Ed said, you know, it's complex, doesn't begin to describe this project. So the list of challenges we face is way too long to talk about and discuss here. So I've got just 4 bullets up on this slide that I'll just briefly touch on, and then we'll go to a few slides that focus on if we were going to start over, what we'd do. So, you know, if you guys are entering into some sort of a curriculum development project, some things you may want to keep in mind. This project works with a large geographically separated group. So by large, we're talking 25 to 30 people. A lot of them are part-time. About half of these are nearby to Michigan Tech, where our project is based, but the other half are far away in Michigan or in one of 6 other states. Part of this is because Michigan Tech is up in a remote and isolated location, but part of it is because NGSS experts are few and far between, and they're hard to find sometimes. So no matter where you are, you're likely to have this separation. So we use 2 primary technologies to help with this. One is virtual meeting software, kind of like what we're using here, or GoToMeeting or something like that. And then we use cloud-based document creation tools like Google Docs or Google Drive in our case, that allows, you know, a lot of people to work on one document, sometimes even simultaneously. Like Matt and I can be in, you know, he's in D.C., I'm way up here in Michigan, and we can be working on the same document right at the same time, which is really nice and hard to imagine doing a project without that. Of course, it takes time for people to learn and use these well, so you need to kind of plan that in. You know, if you're going to bring people in, how are you going to train them to use these things? And there are lots of resources available, but it's worth thinking about. In terms of a file system and like using Google Drive, I would also, you know, look for an expert or become an expert in how to use that. How do you do your file structure? How do you name files? All those kinds of things become really important to keep things moving along. As far as time and schedule management, the second bullet there, I can do this pretty quickly, but having a clear vision of what you're shooting for is vital, but you need a good roadmap to get there. And of course, you know, we want to set goals and deadlines, but because this is all brand new stuff and it's all new to everyone, these goals, you can set these goals, but you have to realize they're going to flex. And Ed, in our discussion a few days ago, used some words I thought were pretty good. He says, yeah, you're going to have to flex, but you don't want to flex yourself out of success. So at some point, you do have to stop flexing and move on. third thing, effectively using teachers' talents. We learned this. We brought on a lot of teachers initially and put them to work writing lesson plans, because of course teachers can write lesson plans because they use them all the time. But what they often can't do is write lesson plans for other people, because they're used to doing them for themselves. But to write a lesson plan that can be used by any other teacher is a different skill set. And so in time, working with a group of teachers, you eventually learn what their skill sets are. But if you're beginning this, I would suggest you use a survey or some application process to find out, are teachers really good at just developing activities and really keeping students engaged in a more of a fun way, or are they more detail oriented and good at writing detailed lesson plans for others and those kinds of things. It can really help to get people on the right path sooner. Finally, communication in any project is key when you have all sorts of people all over the place, so scientists, engineers, curriculum designers, teachers, and researchers. I could go on and on. Communication is really critical. And so developing a vocabulary of what you mean when you say lesson. So Matt earlier showed you that pentagram, which is our lesson. A lesson to us can last many days, but often most people think of a lesson as what happens in one 50-minute class period. So those sorts of things are really important. We use this Google Doc system, but we have something we call a virtual binder that has guiding documents and examples, so that, for example, if I am going to write a lesson introduction and a lesson plan, I can look at that and have an example and look at a guide to tell me what its purpose is and how it should be structured, so that the lesson plan for some lesson in the middle of grade 8 that Doug might write is pretty similar to a lesson in grade 6 that Matt Hoover might be writing. So those kinds of things are really we found them very, very useful. So those are just a few tips on keeping the communication channels open. If we were going to start over here, and the major things we would do differently, I'm just going to touch on a few of those. So one is to start small with your team size and your task list. So I would suggest you develop a prototype and test it so that you have a model to serve as an example, and have this small core team agree on it so that you can move from that point. And as you grow, you'll have those to build off of. Of course, those are going to change, but it's really important to start with that rather than trying to tackle a whole lot of curriculum all at once with a large number of people. This photograph is actually of our curriculum development team after our first summer when we came back together to see what we had. So we learned a lot by going through that process, but it was not the easiest lesson. As your size grows, once you have this model, you can design and communicate guidelines as you build in complexity and size and scope. You can design and adhere to a management and reporting structure to make sure everybody knows what their responsibilities are. If you start to fold in assessment, the sooner you do that, the better. But don't underestimate the level of challenge of 3D curriculum and assessment. It's a big job, and we've learned from building our airplane at the same time we're trying to fly it. And finally, and this has come up before, but the need for PD. Research shows, and our experience tells us, that PD is critical if a new curriculum is going to be successfully adopted. So you need to start planning for this early. When you bring teachers on in the beginning, you can kind of test your professional development in that stage and keep building on that as you move toward the point where you're going to move it out into the wild, as I say, and you're going to have to develop the PD for teachers to actually implement this. So, I mean, now professional development is actually becoming part of our curriculum development process. We're thinking about it early on, but that wasn't the case initially. We've used a combination of online and face-to-face PD as we've gone. Now that we're moving from pilot and field testing, we're starting to think about going out into the wild. It's harder and harder as you spread out to do face-to-face. So we're looking at ways to get the most from our PD dollars by using online systems. So as we move ahead, we will continue to learn. So you can stay tuned and keep learning from us as we learn. So I'll pass it over to Susan, who can wrap things up or take this where she would like to go.
Right. Well, thank you very much. It's really exciting, and I can see there's a lot of interest in getting the keys to the universe with the virtual binder when you're ready eventually to share your process. And I hear you about the lessons learned and the importance of starting and then scaling. But we have a few minutes left for questions. So so Ed, if you'd like to address the engineering question, I see that Jackie put a link to the paper in the chat, but maybe would you like to describe a little?
Yeah, sorry, I only got the last part of your comment there. You want to know a little bit more about how engineering is being integrated into a unit, is that right?
That's right.
Okay. Well, coming back to the unit that I was describing earlier, the ecology unit, one of the things that students do in there is, of course, in science, you're as the NGSS, as they kind of try to differentiate between science and engineering. In science, you develop explanations and ask questions about natural phenomena. Well, and engineering is problem-focused. So students identify a problem, they ask questions to identify a problem, and then develop solutions to solve that problem. And so in the ecology unit, what students are asked to do is to develop a solution to this problem of an invasive species in an ecosystem. And so the way they go about doing that is the problem that they identify, of course, is the invasive species. But they then look at different options that to be considered for dealing with that invasive species, and they use a decision-making matrix to help them weigh those options to come upon the optimal solution. And that requires them to look at certain criteria and constraints for each of the different options. And so they go through this process and they apply what they've learned throughout the unit to identify the optimal solution. And the solution is that's the engineering solution to the problem of invasive species. And their solution might be they have to remove the invasive species, or they have to create something to prevent it from spreading, or the solution might actually even be to do nothing, just given whatever criterion constraints are defining the problem and the solution itself. So that would be an example of where I think often people think of engineering as an application of physical science concepts, and here it's actually within a context of ecology. That students design a solution to a problem. So is that helpful, or is there any follow-up questions to that?
I think that is helpful, and I agree with you that a lot of times when we're talking about engineering, people are thinking about technology, and some of the performance expectations are written specifically like that. We'll examine a technological solutions, but I think that it's also very, very inspiring and a great thing to build on, to think about engineering with a small e, meaning more like thinking like an engineer and examining lots of different solutions, whether they be technological or otherwise. So hopefully that answers the question. So I would encourage a follow-up question from the person who asked that if need be. We've got, it's 1 minute till the hour, so maybe a quick answer to, do you have any connection to elementary curriculum, or do you know of other elementary curriculum that are similar?
This is Ed. The one that a lot of folks are looking at as being somewhat NGSS-aligned is the engineering is elementary. I know that that's one that I've seen in schools. FOSS, I know, is doing some work, Full Option Science Series out of Lawrence Hall. But I can't say whether or not that, I have not done an assessment myself to see if it's would really be considered aligned with NGSS at the elementary level.
So maybe
there's one in Michigan. This is Doug. There's one in Michigan called Phenomenal Science that's out being, I think it's out of Central Michigan University. But if you look that up, I think that's widely available.
Okay. And certainly the kind of thinking you've been talking about, the kind of development you've been talking about could also be used at elementary levels. So with that, I want to thank you all for presenting, and it's such inspirational work that you're doing. Just looking forward to seeing more and more come out of MyStar. And with that, I want to remind everybody that we have 3 more webinars scheduled at the same time, second Thursday of the month, for the next 3 weeks. I hope to see the participants here again. Tell your friends. And with that, I want to thank you all. Thank you, Jackie and Ed and Doug and Matt, for sharing all of your great work with us.